Welcome back to Frontline USA, coming to you this week from the anti-war protests on the streets of Washington, D.C. Now, we don't just cover the issues on this show, we also cover the coverage. In this election campaign, the Iraq War is the #2 issue after the nation's plummeting economy. So how's it playing out on America's airwaves? Here's Richard Gisbert with Election Post.
After making headlines for the past 5 years, news from Iraq has become a casualty in the battle for the front pages. This week on Election Post, Iraq losing the fight to capture the attention of news organizations and the audiences they report to. Americans watching the news these days could well ask themselves, whatever happened to Iraq?
Wall Street is bracing for more fallout from the subprime mortgage crisis this week.
New York Governor Eliot Spitzer, a Democrat, became entangled in a prostitution scandal.
There is continuing fallout today over comments made by Barack Obama's pastor, the Reverend Jeremiah Wright.
According to a survey of news output by the Washington-based Project for Excellence in Journalism, in the first 10 weeks of last year, 23% of all news coverage in the U.S. consisted of reporting from Iraq. Over the same period this year, that figure is just 3%.
Well, it's dropped dramatically because of the U.S. elections, principally, and secondarily because the economy in the United States is on the verge of a train wreck.
The economy is already in a recession.
You put that on top of a sex scandal in New York this week and a few other things, and in fact, 3% would be an overestimate. In the last couple of weeks, it's been below 1%.
We have limited column inches in order to put the news. Network television has limited time. And so I think that as the Iraq news gets crowded out by other subjects, the economy, the campaign for president, that there's less and less space devoted to Iraq.
And fewer questions asked of the Bush administration. Dana Perino is the White House press secretary.
Dana, when's the last time you got a question about Iraq when you're in the press briefing?
I don't know if this is precise, but I don't remember having sustained questions about Iraq. Maybe there'll be one off, but really since probably early December.
Part of news is what's new. And there's not a lot new in Iraq, aside from a tragedy occurring periodically, as has been happening now for 5 years.
A big part of the U.S. coverage of Iraq this past week was tied to Republican presidential candidate John McCain's visit there.
It is John McCain's 8th trip to Iraq. It is his first, though, since becoming the Republican Party's presumptive nominee for U.S. president.
McCain is the only candidate left who supports the war.
He needs to try to portray that things are going better in Iraq. Look, I even went there in March, right before the anniversary, and was walking around. Things are improving. We are making progress. We can stay there. His campaign is heavily dependent on trying to maintain that facade, and it is a facade. I mean, just look where he goes in Baghdad, who he's talking to, and how free he actually is and how safe he actually is there.
The campaign for presidency is all about leadership, and what better way to show that you're a leader than to go and review the troops and to make public comments that are guaranteed to get some coverage about Iraq.
While you see that grown-up vision of John McCain overseas, you're seeing the squabbling and the pettiness on the Democrats.
This week, he was looking pretty presidential in Baghdad, talking security with Nouri al-Maliki.
And so, to the extent that people do want to do an Iraq story, there's John McCain sitting there kind of giving them a nicely packaged story.
John McCain's visit brought the election campaign and the Iraq issue together, but there hasn't been much of that, at least not yet.
It's been in the interests of the leading political candidates to have Iraq be less in the spotlight, because none of them are talking about withdrawal, which is what the majority of the people in the United States now want.
And I don't think Americans are concerned if we're there for 100 years or 1,000 years or 10,000 years.
We have the media really focusing on more what the candidates want them to talk about, where, well, we'll manage the occupation a little bit better, or we'll run things better if we come into power, but none of them are talking about what is the national security strategy of the United States.
There was no such thing as al-Qaeda in Iraq until George Bush and John McCain decided to invade Iraq.
Senator McCain, who is willing to keep this war going for 100 years.
Senator Clinton says she wants to surrender in Iraq. She wants to wave the white flag.
And we'll be back next week with more on the media and the American elections here on Election Post.
Away from the protests, we're here at the Vietnam War Memorial, commemorating one of the longest and most controversial wars in U.S. history. In 1971, after more than a decade at war, hundreds of Vietnam veterans gathered in Detroit to tell their own stories of the reality of war, a war that had been largely misrepresented to the public until that point. They spoke for the first time publicly about atrocities they had witnessed, atrocities they had committed. It was a turning point in the anti-war movement. The event was called Winter Soldier. Fast forward 37 years, and Winter Soldier is back. This week, hundreds of U.S. veterans gathered outside of Washington, D.C. to speak the truth of what they've seen and done in Iraq and Afghanistan. Stories silenced by the Pentagon and, incredibly, virtually ignored by the mainstream media.
There's a term, once a Marine, always a Marine, but there's also the term, eat the apple, F the core. I don't work for you no more.
In Vietnam, the anti-war movement within the military was a critical factor in bringing the war to an end. Could it happen again? This is a face of the U.S. military that people around the world have never seen.
On April 18th, 2006, I had my first confirmed kill. This man was innocent. I don't know his name. I called him the Fat Man. He was walking back to his house, and I shot him in front of his friend and his father. The first round didn't kill him after I had hit him up here in his neck area. And afterwards, he started screaming and looked right into my eyes. So I looked at my friend who I was on post with, and I said, well, I can't let that happen. So I took another shot and took him out. I just want to say that I am sorry for the hate and destruction that I've inflicted on innocent people, and I'm sorry for the hate and destruction that others have inflicted on innocent people. At one point, it was okay, but reality has shown that it is not, and that this is happening, and that until people hear about what is going on with this war, it will continue to happen and people will continue to die. I am sorry for the things that I did. I am no longer the monster that I once was.
On the 5th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, we'd like to give the last word in this week's show to a winter soldier named Clifton Hicks. Here's the testimony he shared with us.
Occupation is occupation, war is war, combat is combat, murder is murder, death is death. Whether it happened 5 years ago or it happened yesterday, it's just as horrible, it's just as bloody, it's just as unfortunate, and most importantly, it's just as unnecessary. You know, people talk about the surge and the so-called success of the surge. It's an interesting way to gauge success is by, they call it success when we send, 30,000 more soldiers in there. And if we didn't really mess the place and devastate the country before, now we're really going to do it. I think it's ridiculous to even talk of success, or change or improvement. It's just non-existent. I don't see it. I don't see improvement will begin when we leave the country, is what I believe. And I think that just illustrates just the horror and the futility of this war, the fact that so many civilians must die in order for this war to go on day to day, day after day after day, with no end in sight, no real tangible goals laid out, no real plan to get to these imaginary goals in the first place. But yet it's all supposed to be worth all this so-called collateral damage, people's mothers and fathers and children and their livestock and their property and their infrastructure and their culture. I mean, their very heritage has been destroyed because of this war. I mean, Iraq will never recover from this, certainly not in my lifetime. And it's just, it's necessary on the one hand because we're fighting a war. This is the nature of this war. This is what happens in this war. But it's on the big picture, it's totally unnecessary. It's a tragedy. It's a farce. It's a waste. I mean, we had no business. This war we shouldn't even be in this room right now talking about this. I should never have gone there. I should never have even had the option of going there. That was a betrayal in itself, that I just, as a young American teenager, I had the option of going to fight in this stupid war.